We begin in New Hampshire, where some of the polls have closed. In 1 hour, all polls will close, and results will start to tell the story of the evening from the first state primary of the 2024 election. The field is a tiny one by historical standards for this stage of the race. In 2016, there were 7 competitors in the GOP field. Now, only Donald Trump and Nikki Haley are competing. Trump's victory in Iowa last week was so commanding, he bounced the once formidable Florida Governor Ron DeSantis from the race after a mere 1 contest. 22 delegates will be awarded proportionally tonight, and Nikki Haley hopes she'll be around long enough for that to matter, because the final delegate tally at the end of the primary season is a lifetime away. The immediate threat comes from a party base and elected officials who have lined up behind the former president and see him as a shoo-in.
I'm running against Donald Trump, and I'm not going to talk about an obituary just because y'all think we have to talk about it. I'm going to talk about running the tape and saving this country.
I would never ask anybody to pull out. I didn't ask Ron to pull out. I didn't ask Vivek to pull out. Nobody. But we have great support, and most of the people that pulled out have already supported me.
We've got almost enough reporters on the ground to field a football team, and they're across the state. And our Anthony Salvanto is here watching the numbers in New York at the data desk. But we start with our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, and our chief election and campaign correspondent, Robert Costa, in Manchester, and joined by White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who is at a Trump watch party in Nashua. Major, I'll start with you as we await results. What are you looking for?
2 things, John. Numbers and lyrics, if you will. Here's on the number side, not only the turnout, but the composition. In New Hampshire, as you well know, the largest block of voters is undeclared. There are about 344,000 undeclared voters in New Hampshire compared to about 267,000 registered Republicans. And if turnout is, as projections currently indicate, above 300,000 or maybe 320, maybe 330,000, is there a composition of undeclared there that provide a secret boost of fuel for Nikki Haley to get more competitive to former President Trump, who is clearly the front runner? Okay, that's the numbers. What do I mean by lyrics? Nikki Haley, and this is worth spending a second to consider, she said, my goal is to make this a 2-person race weeks and weeks ago. She's done that. All right, what are you going to do with this one-on-one confrontation with the former president? What are your lyrics going to be from New Hampshire to galvanize people about the importance of this race and why you are a better alternative than the former president? Because she's going to be attacked and attacked aggressively in South Carolina, more so than she was here. What are your lyrics going to be to tell voters you are the better choice?
Major, you've set up the next question for me nicely to Bob, which is Bob. It's been hard for challengers to weaken Donald Trump. But the theory was if it came down to a 2-person race, then perhaps the case could be made against him. Is there any argument that Haley has made that has been successful along those lines, or that looked like it might become successful if she can make it past New Hampshire?
John, great to be with you here on election night. It's evident to me, based on our reporting at CBS in recent days, that the Haley argument you're talking about has been evolving. For so many weeks, we've heard about Haley talking about the, quote, chaos around former President Donald Trump. Now she has sharpened her attack, and she is talking about what she perceives as Trump's decline. Mentally, politically, physically. She's casting it in a broad sense, but she's talking about decline. And she's saying to Republican voters at this crucial crossroads, do you really want to have a nominee who is making mistakes on stage? If he's going to run against President Biden, who's over age 80, do you want to have a standard bearer who's making mistakes in calling me Nancy Pelosi instead of Nikki Haley? Do you want a standard bearer who's going to face 2 federal trials potentially later this year? It's a sharper attack. We'll see if it works in a state like New Hampshire and whether it's enough to elevate her into South Carolina, but more importantly, if it keeps her in the race until Super Tuesday. South Carolina is going to be tough. Even if she has a great night here, that's Trump country. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina was talking with Major and I earlier today about that. At the same time, there are states on Super Tuesday in early March like Colorado, Virginia, Utah, she could possibly play in if she gets a bit of a bump out of New Hampshire.
Ed, what struck you about the electorate in New Hampshire as you've seen it there compared with what we saw last week in Iowa?
A few things, John. As expected, this is a far less MAGA-centric or Trump-loving electorate. Only about 1/3 of voters who showed up today, based on the early exit polls, describe themselves as MAGA, or the Make America Great Again movement that surrounds the former president. 45% of voters here, independents. That's far more than participated in Iowa's caucuses last week. The other thing is, once again, we're getting confirmation voters are angry, incredibly dissatisfied with the direction of the country. About 45% saying dissatisfied, 32%, a third essentially, saying they're angry about the direction of the country. And also there's much more skepticism in this state, John, about whether or not Donald Trump would be fit to serve as president if he is convicted of a crime in the coming months in the midst of this campaign. All of this is important to the broader general election focus, an argument that Nikki Haley and Chris Sununu have been making here in New Hampshire. He can't win states like New Hampshire. He lost narrowly in 2016. He lost it in 2020 to President Biden. And the argument they're making, and now what the exit polling is showing us, is he may have the same exact problem again and fail to win the 4 electoral votes here from the Granite State.
Major, we're going to hear the words moderate and conservative all night. Those words have been really scrambled. Can you give us a quick definition of what those words mean to you so we know what we're talking about?
Well, moderate has sort of become a way of describing someone who is not MAGA-centric or tightly aligned with former President Trump. And there's lots of other, far more disparaging names. Rhino, Republican in name only, globalist, weakling. Anyone who's not in the Trump orbit is disparaged by Trump and those close to him as not only insufficiently Republican, but insufficiently loyal to Trump. They don't get it. They don't understand how to fight. On the MAGA side, and we see it in exit polling here, just like we saw in Iowa, what's the #1 characteristic people like about Trump? Fights for someone like me. That fighter edge that Trump brings to not only rhetoric but to campaigning is definitional for his supporters. And what Nikki Haley has to do here and elsewhere is say, yes, I can fight, but I won't be as hobbled by other things, like Bob Costa mentioned, that inevitably the former president will have to combat, whether he wants to or not. Those realities, legal, criminal, civil, are not going away. We need a clean argument against Biden, and Haley is saying, I can be one to wage that clean fight against Biden.
And Bob, as time runs out here, what does Nikki Haley face if she does well enough to go and get some kind of a little boost out of New Hampshire? What's she going to face from Trump?
She's going to face a barrage of attacks, and she's going to face a Republican Party that's largely in Trump's grip already, urging her to coalesce around Trump to get out of the race. But for Nikki Haley, this is a crossroads personally and historically. So often in presidential politics, John, as you've documented over the years in your books and reporting, you only have one shot. And if you don't take that shot and really try to push yourself toward the nomination and fight it out, then you may never get that shot again. World events change, people change, parties change. And for now, she is in the sweet spot for the first time in her political career as the person who could be the leader of the traditional Republican wing inside the GOP nationally. She has always been orbiting that role, but right now she is in the race for president as someone who could say to the rest of the party that doesn't like Trump, I'm for you, I can bring women, independents, and others into this coalition. The question I always have for any politician I cover is, how much political pain are you willing to tolerate? Can you take a 15, 20-point blowout in South Carolina and then go into Super Tuesday? Can you wait for those federal trials to start and keep making the case against Trump, trudging through all these different states across the country? It's a hard case to make for someone who's politically young, like Ambassador Haley, who has likely future runs in her. But what does she really want to do? Only Nikki Haley can answer that question.
Pain threshold, a great question. Quickly to you, Ed, you cover the Biden White House. Would they rather this race be over, make it a two-man race with Donald Trump, or see the Republicans have a big, zesty fight full of possible ammunition that Biden could use later?
They wouldn't mind that, but they concede that if it's a big win by the former president tonight here in New Hampshire, the general election effectively begins tomorrow. And they've got a $120 million war chest ready to go across the country as needed. You saw this joint rally he held with the vice president today in Virginia, focused on the issue of abortion rights, but overtaken by protesters in the room concerned about the situation in the Middle East. That's something he's going to continue to face from his base. The other thing they keep an eye on, or the other thing that we're now watching, a bit of a shakeup. This is traditional. Senior aide from the West Wing, Mike Donnellan, his speechwriter, and Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, who's been running operations for the West Wing ever since she ran the 2020 campaign, are now being sent from Washington to Wilmington to run the advertising in the case of Donald. He's written some of the president's best ads and speeches, or most effective ones, at least people would say. And then O'Malley Dillon will focus on the nuts and bolts of getting the 270 electoral votes. A critical thing in this season where battleground states like Michigan may be on the bubble, given the situation in the Middle East and growing concern among Democrats there.
Major Garrett, Robert Costa, and Ed O'Keefe, thank you to all three of you. Great stuff. For more, let's bring in CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, it's good to be back with you again. So we've got some polls that are closed. Help us understand what we can see or know at this period, because obviously some voting is still going on in New Hampshire.
It is, but we've been talking to people as they're leaving the polling place all day, and a couple of things stand out. One is, and you mentioned it in the first segment, this split on whether or not people think Donald Trump would be fit to be president if convicted of a crime. This is defining in many ways, right? You might expect people who say no to be more for Nikki Haley. At least that's what we would have expected based on the pre-election polling. So we're going to watch these numbers and see if that, in fact, shapes up tonight. But the other thing I need to say here is that this is very different than it was in Iowa. In the Iowa case, this was about 2/3 who said yes. That's a much more right-leaning, that's a much more MAGA electorate, and that's a big part of it. And the other part of this, John, is when you look at the differences in why people are voting for their candidate, I'm going to start with this, with Haley. Her number one answer is has the right temperament. And that echoes some of what we've been seeing in the last week on the campaign trail, right? Her talking about about temperament, contrasting herself to Donald Trump, maybe some campaign effects there. Whereas Donald Trump, this is more of the same. His top response among his voters is that he fights for people like me, and that's part of that larger narrative that we've seen, where even things like his indictments, his voters tell us, just pushes them to support him more, seeing him as somebody not just fighting for them, but also taking it very personally and seeing it all as politically motivated. So those are some of the big attitudinal splits that I think we need to watch tonight, John.
So at the end of tonight, Anthony, we're going to have some ideas about what happened in New Hampshire, and we're going to have what we know happened in Iowa. Is there a way to think intelligently about those two sets of numbers as people make judgments about what the Republican Party looks like and what kind of how to try not to fall into the trap of thinking the entire party is determined by just the participants, but also recognizing that the participants in the caucus and the primary have a real sway over the shape and direction of a party? That's a lot to ask you.
Well, I think you set up the two states traditionally as two different tests. The first test in Iowa is a test of can you appeal to the most ideological part of your base. Historically, that's what Iowa is. It's why Iowa has not always picked the eventual nominee, but it also sets up as an organizing test. And you saw that last week with support for Donald Trump, the higher numbers who say they're part of the MAGA movement. That's an identity affiliation there. But then compare the New Hampshire primary, which is traditionally set up as can you win among a broader electorate? Ultimately, this nominee has to go on to the general. So the fact that there are a lot more independents in New Hampshire is often seen as a test of that broader electability. And if Nikki Haley does well among independents, that would probably at least politically bolster her claim, as she's been making against the former president, that she fares better against Joe Biden. So two different states, two different electorates, and two different political tests.
And the central question of the Republican Party, nicely teed up, Anthony. Anthony Salvanto, we will be checking back in with you in a bit. Thanks.